I know you're frightened. I know you're anxious. I know this time can be so terribly difficult. And maybe you're housebound with a hijackal. Maybe you're having to live 24/7 with the person you'd least like to be confined with. We're going to talk today with a scientist, the real word. We're going to talk with David Vigerust. He's Dr. David Vigerust, and we're going to get the real word on what's happening in our world and what you need to know about it. So stay tuned. Welcome to Save Your Sanity podcast. I'm Dr. Rhoberta Shaler. Are you living with the chaos, confusion, and uncertainty that a toxic person loves to create? Is a partner, parent, ex, sibling, child, or coworker causing you to second-guess yourself? That can be crazy-making. I'm here to help you save your sanity. So let's get down to it and figure some things out now. Stay tuned. Welcome to Save Your Sanity. If you're joining us for the first time, I'm so glad you found us. And if you're returning, I'm glad you found value and came back. Please feel free to share this podcast with your friends. There are so many people who are isolated and marginalized and think they're the only ones going through this, right? So you can be the one who shares things with you. And today we're going to have quite a different episode, because we're not going to be talking only about hijackals. We're going to talk about the hijackal virus that is hijacking our lives right now. And I'm so delighted to welcome you to the program, David.
Thank you so much for for letting me be here with you today.
Well, it's exciting to me to have the real word from the scientific community. I want everybody to know this is Dr. David Vigerust. He's the President and Chief Scientific Officer for ZDX Health, an advanced molecular diagnostics company specializing, get this, in solutions for infectious diseases and prevention medicine. And he has so many credentials. He's also maintains an adjunct assistant professor position at Vanderbilt University Medical Center in the Department of Neurological Science Surgery. And he's a clinical assistant professor at the University of Maryland, Eastern Shore School of Pharmacy. So you've got the definitive word on what's going on here. How much fear do you think is logical at this time?
Well, I mean, there's a lot of people worried about this. This is a significant pandemic, something we've never experienced before. So, in that regard, people are not sure how to behave, not sure what to do, not sure how to take the information that's been provided by our government and our other leaders. So, I've seen a substantial number of people very worried, very scared, unsure of where their place is in this current pandemic. So it's scary for a lot of people, especially those that have, some conditions that might pre-exist them to more severe symptoms.
Well, I'm one of those people. So the only thing that's concerning me is what happens when I run out of fresh vegetables and fruit. I'm not sure, but I will find a way. But, if we don't have good information, if we don't have reliable information, reliable scientific, factual information, we can go even more fearful. And so tell us what the real deal is here. What do you know about the coronavirus, the pandemic, the timing? Tell us what you know. What's the latest word?
Well, the timing of this falls, towards the tail end of our respiratory season, right? So we've got a lot of uncertain symptoms. So, folks are still going through influenza. They're still having colds. That's creating a lot more stress and anxiety because they automatically assume that when they have a cough or a sniffle, that it's going to be a coronavirus. Coronaviruses are not new to humans. We've been exposed to them for a significant amount of time. This one, however, is coming from an animal reservoir. And when that happens, that animal is fairly in balance with this pathogen. And we are very much out of balance with this pathogen. So it's running through the population very quickly.
What does it mean, David, to be balanced with a pathogen?
Well, in nature, viruses are constantly in flux with a host. And in this case, this coronavirus likely came from a bat. And in that bat, it likely did not have any symptomology whatsoever. The virus goes through its life cycle in the bat, passes to another bat, passes to another bat, and very rarely causes any symptoms in that animal. And that's partly because it's become balanced, or it's in kind of a homeostasis with the host. We're a brand new host. And as such, we don't have natural immunity to it. We don't have any defenses because we've not encountered this virus before. So these viruses tend, when they get into a new host, whether it's humans or another animal, tend to go very much overboard because there are no checks and balances to control them. And that's what we're experiencing right now, is a brand new virus to the human population. It's going through very rapidly. It's highly transmissible. That's the other issue that we're dealing with, is this has a very rapid replication. And as such, it's very easy to spread through droplets, through coughs, through surface contact. So it's an entirely new experience for many people, although we go through these kinds of epidemics very frequently. We just forget.
Yes, and we forget that we respond differently each time. Like I've heard some people comparing it to the H1N1 virus, as that was what was previously. And we didn't have a shutdown. We didn't have this level of fear. We had concern, we had information, but it didn't feel so personal. What do you think made that difference?
I think we've become accustomed to influenzas not being too terribly problematic or troublesome. Even though we told people this is a brand new influenza virus, it's not been encountered by humans before. That 2009 outbreak infected 60 million people and caused the death of almost 300,000 people. You know, that we sort of went about our business thinking, well, it's just the flu. You know, we get flu all the time. It's not a big deal. Very few people had ever heard of coronavirus, even though every year when we have a cold or cold-like symptoms, coronavirus is likely one of the primary suspects. But those 4 that have been with us for the last 60 years or so are very much in balance with us. They don't cause us too much illness. So I think the big difference here is that we're accustomed to sort of hearing about flu every year, and we've sort of just taken it out of our mind as a dangerous organism. And this is something brand new, so it's creating a lot more mystery. It's creating a lot more fear about an unknown.
Does coronavirus and the H1N1 virus, did they have a similar rate of replication?
They're both fairly rapid replicating viruses. The difference is going to be how easily they can transmit from one person to another. This virus seems to be very good at transmitting from person to person. And flu, that particular variant of flu, transmitted easily among people, but it wasn't quite as fast or as efficient as this coronavirus is.
And how about staying on surfaces and remaining alive? Were they similar in that regard?
Flu doesn't have quite as much longevity on surfaces. These viruses have an envelope, so they have a fatty envelope around them. That makes them susceptible to environmental conditions, whether it's heat or detergents or soaps. This virus seems to be a little more stable on surfaces, especially things like plastics and stainless steel. It doesn't have a very long lifespan but it doesn't have a very long viability on cardboard and those kinds of things that are more porous and might draw some of the moisture out of them. So, it's similar in many respects. You want to try to wipe surfaces down even with the flu, because those droplets are laden with virus.
Right. Well, I think this is really important information because we are getting conflicting information about surfaces. And, heavens, I may not want to buy into the billions of dollars that Jeff Bezos makes, but my goodness, he's making my life awfully easy these days. So I'm leaving his cardboard outside for 3 hours before I go near it. And then I put my gloves on and I use my scissors and I open the box outside. Then I throw the box away. Then I come in and wash my gloves and take the items out of the thing. And then I wash my gloves again. And then, I have antibacterial. And then I feel like I can I can let those products sit for a while and they'll be fine. But it's very important to understand that transmission, because we get the mail and people could be afraid of getting the mail or getting these packages. And we need to be informed about what's real, because there's a lot of scaremongering out there. And then there's this other seemingly incredible side that seems to give the impression that we as regular humans can somehow direct this virus to tell it how long it's going to live. And that kind of information is really not helpful to us. I'm really sorry to see Dr. Fauci seemingly getting more and more exhausted looking, of course, in every appearance that he has. But, oh, we need him, and we need people like you. So I want to remind everybody, I'm talking to Dr. David Vigerust. He is the person in the know about all of this, as I said earlier. He is a chief scientific officer at a molecular diagnostic company, and it specializes in infectious diseases and prevention. So we're talking about the real information here. So if somebody stays in and they're doing the precautions maybe that I was talking about, being careful of what you bring into the house, what can they do if they have to go out and they have to procure their groceries? What is the best protocol in your idea?
Being very, very cognizant of how close people are to you. Again, just like you're being very cautious about picking up boxes, wash your hands frequently. If you have sanitizer, use them frequently while you're going to the store. Wipe down any surfaces that your hands are touching, like the cart or the handles of the baskets. I'm just being very watchful about the people around me, trying to keep some level of distance, 6 or 10 feet. Watchful and very aware of people who are maybe coughing or sneezing, trying to avoid those kinds of things. It's back to the social distancing. It does do a tremendous amount of good to keep some space between us and just be really aware. I mean, I think maybe we're going to get to be much more aware of our surroundings when, not so long ago, we were very oblivious to what's going on around us. Now we're hyper aware.
Well, yes, and being aware of the physics of the whole thing. I mean, if a droplet comes out of your mouth, the physics of it has to drop. I mean, eventually. So it may nebulize, of course. Some of them do, I understand. But that social distancing is to give it the opportunity to drop. And that's just a great way to visualize what's going on, that you sent me something and it fell down between us because there was enough space for it, which is, of course, one of the reasons they tell us to leave our shoes outside. But is that an important precaution, is to change your shoes when you come in and put your clothes in the washer?
It would be wise, just to make sure that any potential exposure that you might have had while you were out and about is eliminated. Keeping the shoes outside, taking the jacket or something off, maybe washing it if you were around a lot of people shortly after you come back in. Any of those kinds of measures where you can distance yourself from the exposures that you may have had is a smart idea, especially for those that might have some risk factors.
Well, I was talking with a client the other day, and they were very, very anxious. And they said, I live alone and I haven't been out of the house, but remembering to wash my hands every 20 minutes is really hard. And I said, what? Why are you washing your hands every 20 minutes? You're in your own environment. I mean, you're in your own ecosystem. You don't have to wash your hands every 20 minutes. I think maybe there are things that are being said that are not being defined. What would you say about that advice I gave my client?
That's exactly right. If they haven't had an exposure and they've been in their own environment, they're not exposed to anything, other than what they have been around, all day and, night and days previous, especially if they haven't been outside. We've encountered a number of folks in our neighborhood who is somewhat similar, right? They've had a significant amount of fear about this, so they've stayed home. And they may have someone who goes to the store and shops for them and brings those groceries to them. But if they're by themselves, or if they're with their own family and the family has not had any exposure outside, just thinking about well, I haven't had an exposure. It's good to be clean. Washing your hands frequently is never a bad thing, but to be habitual about it in the absence of the exposure might be taking things just a little too far and taking it maybe more literally than was originally intended.
Well, that's where I think we're making a mistake in the public health thing, because we're not defining it or refining it enough to say, but if you haven't been out, if you've been living in your own ecosystem, you haven't brought anything in that you have to be washing off. I mean, it's certainly we all are wise, as you say, to wash our hands frequently. It's just a good idea. But this protocol of every 20 minutes and do this and do that, that's if you've come in and there's a potential you've brought something with you. So we want to allay people's fears that if they're staying home, they don't have to be washing their hands every 20 minutes. So important. So why do you think this coronavirus is coming to the attention as a pandemic when previously we have not even had this kind of coverage for H1N1 or other things that, 300,000 deaths is nothing to sneeze at, no pun intended. But, we're not approaching that right now, but the forecasts are for sure. Why do you think this particular one is causing this huge fear and consuming all of our attention?
It's had a lot of media exposure, and the media exposure that first came out of China was very, very graphic, right? You saw people who were being arrested. You saw people in full Tyvek suits, head to toe suits, respirators. It looked like a very scary event that was happening. So you see those kinds of images, and you think, well, this must be really bad if we're locking down cities and physically quarantining people into the buildings. And then it gets out of that local and it gets into the larger country, and then it starts to migrate outside. And then you hear people say, oh, I told you so. I told you this was going to happen. We've had a number of people who've come out and said, I've been telling you for years that there was going to be a big pandemic that was going to be the next apocalypse. Right. So we've had a lot of people coming forth with very scary images, both verbal images and visual things where it looks frightening to people. And when it starts to move from country to country, and then you start to highlight the number of deaths, and that's the lead in the news is 200 people died last night. 1,000 people have died here. You make it into a situation where everyone just has almost constant fear and anxiety about it.
What do you think the benefit of that is? Do you think it's making us just aware? Do you think it's making us overly cautious? Is it putting us into a fear situation, particularly in our country where we're supposed to believe that someone's going to save us?
Mm-hmm. It's going to be a difficult thing to see how this evolves in the near future here. We're on one hand, I think it's good to be aware that these pandemics can happen and how they happen and explaining that in a very clear way. These pandemics in this particular occurrence and in the H1N1 also were zoonotic infections. They came from animals. Mm-hmm. And it's the way we interact with the environment and those animals that can lead to these kinds of outbreaks. And I think we're going to get some better awareness on how to contain it early. And hopefully we get smart enough when someone says we have to pay attention, that we start to pay attention. We've had a lot of people who said, well, it's not that big a deal. I'm not going to, there were some college age kids down in Florida. A number of them got sick because they continued to go to spring break, even though they were told, you should not be around people right now. But I think it's going to be a number of things. We're going to get more aware. Hopefully we get a little smarter about listening to advice, the right kind of advice, and we become a little more aware. And, the benefit of this in a lot of cases I've noticed here in our neighborhood is families are walking together and they're interacting more. So it's bringing the family back together a little bit, right? They're all in little pockets.
I think that's great. As I said earlier, I just did my last podcast on housebound with a hijackal. I mean, if you're with someone who's verbally emotionally, physically, sexually abusive, this is a really, really hard time to say stay home, because there you are. So in my last podcast, I gave people 10 basic truths that you have to accept if you're in that situation, because you can't poke eye jackals and hope anything good is going to happen. But we are also seeing a rise in the number of domestic violence cases, because when we have a raised anxiety levels, raised stress levels. We have people who are already living in chronic stress, maybe with someone who's emotionally abusive. And so everybody's angry. Everybody feels powerless in the face of a pandemic. And so that level of unnamed powerlessness can come into blaming behavior. It's everybody's dancing on everybody's last nerve, aren't they?
Yes, they are. Yeah.
Yeah, it's really difficult. So I want to ask a question about this balancing in the, if you take the bat situation, and we all have things that live on us, live with us, live within us, that don't bother us. They're just kind of part of the hosting process, and they pass and move on, and we didn't even know it really happened. But in the research world, David, do they actually have researched things that would have previously focused on that bat and the possibility of what is in balance for them being out of balance for humans, and what we might do about it? Or is this a wake-up call?
There's been research on this in the past. Understanding the natural tropism and host of the organism has been an ongoing, body of work. Where we've not quite learned a lesson yet is, and in this particular case, and it happens around the world, I'm not necessarily picking on China, but that's where this came from. Around the world, there are occasions when people will capture wild animals and they're a food source. So in China, there are these wet markets, and there are a number of different species of animals that are all co-housed together, and that allows for this recombination, this movement back and forth of viruses from one animal to another one that may not be the natural host but supports replication, and then we introduce ourselves in the middle of that. That's happened countless times, and so we've understood that from a research perspective for a number of years, going back maybe as far back as the 1918 flu outbreak. We knew that these kinds of things happen. So for 100 years, we knew that organisms can come from wildlife, can come into us and serve as a brand new. We serve as a brand new host.
Mm-hmm.
But so we've known about it. It's not a new thing, but we need to be more aware about it. And just a couple of days ago, I saw that China has actually outlawed any wild meat consumption. So they're trying now, after many years of counsel, that's not a good idea. And even in the rest of the world, Africa has kind of a similar sort of situation where bushmeat is common. We don't understand what all the organisms that exist in those wildlife or in that environment. So it's been around, but I think we're starting to get a little bit more acuity to, we have to pay attention to what we're doing a little bit more, and how we're co-housing these animals together.
Yes, I think that's a very real and solvable problem right there. Is once you recognize this is not a good idea, you can simply stop doing it. But for other situations, I mean, that's not the case. I wondered if there's some kind of similarity between the fact that we never used to hear about Lyme disease, and then people were having symptoms after symptoms, and we were attributing it to other things. And then in the last 20 years, we seem to have become wise to the potential for Lyme disease. Is there some similarity in that?
There will be. I think as we've seen more of these zoonotic infections come out of different ecosystems, we get a little bit more aware of it. People, I think, shy away from some of the science, and they don't pay attention and listen and build upon each one of those occurrences. And with Lyme disease, it took, like you say, it took 20 years, it took 30 years to realize that it wasn't just arthritis, it was an infection that elicited the arthritis, right? So
Right.
slowly we're getting there. This is a kind of event that might help accelerate that uptake of information.
And awareness, like, oh, there are other causes. You know, in my life, I've been very fortunate because I was raised by near my godparents who were very interested in health, and they were in their mid 50s when I was born, so they were interested in alternative medicine, and they raised their own vegetables organically and all of that. So I've always had this great interest, and I used to own a health and yoga retreat center on Vancouver Island in Canada, so I've always had this great interest. And so when I follow these things, and I notice that my clients, which are people who have been either raised by or in a relationship with toxic people, those with diagnosed or undiagnosed personality disorders, we see a much greater incidence of autoimmune situations because they're living in this chronic stress and anxiety all the time. They're, if we want to use a metaphor, they're always inflamed, right? So there are things going on that we can do about that, aside from the fact that we wake up and say, your body is having a response to something that is not a pathogen. It is responding to something that is in your environment, and it's entirely human. And yes, it doesn't happen to everybody, but I was interested in the research of Gabor Mate. I don't know if you know Dr. Mate in Canada, but he did some excessive research, and what he learned in one of his studies, a small study, but significant, he learned that following women for 9 years, I think it was 9 years, I could be wrong, but he followed them and found that women who lived with chronic stress and anxiety, now I'm extrapolating it to my hijackals, but it could be any chronic stress and anxiety, were 9 times more likely to develop breast cancer. Right? Chronic stress and anxiety. Now, we've seen, in my anecdotal observation, I remember when probably 30 years ago, I started in my practice seeing people with this unnamed aches and pains, and when you touched their skin it hurt, and there was nothing supposedly wrong with the skin or the underlying tissue, and see that morph into an understanding of Epstein-Barr, fibromyalgia, things that had a name. And in the beginning it was all in your head, right? Then people were telling you, if you just had less stress and anxiety, but they didn't look at the causes of the stress and anxiety. So this kind of historical perspective of it shows up, and then we say, oh, it's nothing, or it's your fault, or you're doing things wrongly, and then we find out, no, actually there are things in the environment, whether or not they're human or otherwise, that are actually exacerbating these things. And it's very much as a time thing, it seems, before people are willing to entertain the idea that there may be a cause and effect. What do you think?
I agree. Yeah, it does take time for that idea to evolve and for people to come to realize that there is an underlying precipitator of this, right? So I spend a lot of time in inflammation as well. So I can see that inflammation can come from an external source like a microbe, or it can come from an internal source like just being chronically stressed and tired, and just not having a really good healthy, happy foundation.
Well, something's suppressing your immune system.
Right.
And when you're unhappy, and when you're in anxiety, and when your shoulders are up around your earlobes, and you're hypervigilant, and you're overproducing fight or flight hormones and things, it's a system. Something's going to happen.
Right. Yeah, there has to be a response to all that. It's,
Yeah. So what would you say, I know we could talk for a very long time, but what would you say is our best preparation for this pandemic and for any future? What changes do we need to make?
I think we need to be more aware of the kinds of interactions we have with the environment, and identify things like this that have come from an animal source, an environmental source. This happens frequently, and we seem to have a very short-term memory when it happens. Right? We need to put that more into a perspective that if we keep the same behaviors, we're going to have the same sorts of events occurring with us. So if we can start to understand better how the ecology of pathogens and how they interact with us and the kinds of behaviors that we elicit to make those kinds of things happen, we can probably be better prepared in the future. The Chinese are doing a good job by eliminating these markets because we know that they are a definite source. The same sort of conversations have happened elsewhere in Asia and in Africa and South America and all over the world. That's just the nature of culture sometimes, is you eat what you catch, you eat what you find, you eat what's available. But entering into those ecosystems, we have to understand the consequence of doing that. We don't sometimes think about what might happen to us when we enter into that new environment.
I remember when I went to the market in Bangkok, and I could not believe what my eyes saw and my nose smelled. I could not believe it. Some of it was lovely, some of it was far less than lovely, and some of it was downright scary. Like, you're selling those things? How long have they been there? They're still alive. How long have they been dead? I mean, it was just like amazing. But of course, it's like me going into a culture that has a different water system. I am going to be terribly susceptible to it, and other people are used to it. It's become balanced, as you say, within them. So this is vital information. Thank you so much for sharing this with us.
Thank you for having me. Appreciate it.
My guest is Dr. David Vigerust, and he has great information for you. I'm going to put his website in the show notes because you will need to know how to spell it. I will tell you what it is right now for those of you who are sitting at your computer. It is systrategicbiosciences.com, and that's SYTRATEGIC biosciences, plural.com, and it'll be in the show notes. You're also going to be able to hear us on Facebook Live and YouTube Live today. And so look at the YouTube channel, my YouTube channel, for Relationship Help. You will find another conversation that Dr. Vigerust and I will have. In the meantime, take really good care of yourself because you matter, and stay safe. This is a very important thing for you to do. Thank you for joining me on the Save Your Sanity podcast today. I hope you've had some new insights, some ideas and strategies to help you gain clarity and confidence for moving forward toward greater emotional health and safety. You deserve that, and so do your children. If you found value here and would like to support this podcast with $1 or $5 each month, please do so at patreon.com/saveyoursanity. Learn more about how to work with me via video conference, join my optimized circles, or subscribe to this podcast on my YouTube channel at my website, transformingrelationship.com. Talk soon.